want to welcome everyone who are coming into the room. Thank you for attending. This is Healing Racial Trauma, Racial Socialization as a Clinical Strategy for Black Youth. And we will be beginning in a couple of minutes. So welcome to Healing Racial Trauma, Racial Socialization as a Clinical Strategy for Black Youth, provided by the PA Care Partnership in association with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. For this webinar, we will be viewing a 60-minute presentation from our presenter, Dr. Riana Elyse Anderson, Ph.D., following with a live Q&A session with Dr. Anderson. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature, which you will find by running your mouse along the bottom of the Zoom screen. Information will be available at the end of today's presentation for those seeking continuing education credits or a certificate of attendance for this webinar. This information is also available in the email you received from us today. Today's moderators are Kelsey Leonard, our Cultural and Linguistic Competency Coordinator, and myself, Jamal Ford from the PA Care Partnership. It is our honor to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Riana Elyse Anderson, an Assistant Professor in the Health Behavior and Health Education Department in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan, not Washington, Michigan. Dr. Anderson strives to improve psychological outcomes for Black youth through culturally and contextually relevant parenting programs focused on racism and discrimination, effective coping strategies, and community building, participation, and collaboration. Please enjoy the presentation.
All right, welcome everyone. Welcome, good afternoon. My name is Jay Hughley. I'm the interim director here at the Center on Race and Social Problems at the University of Pittsburgh. I bring greetings on behalf of the Chancellor, the Provost Office, who supports our work, and in particular Vice Provost John Wallace, who is also a senior faculty fellow with our center, Dean Betsy Farmer, and the School of Social Work, where we're housed and do a ton of great collaborative work. We are very excited today to talk about an important topic, given everything that's happened this summer. It's been a very difficult summer for Black America, many people of color, but Black America in particular. We've had our head on a swivel as we continue to navigate COVID-19 and the racial disparities there, but then also the issues of police brutality that we faced as a people and as a country. And if you, like me, are a parent, and you may hear a 3- and 5-year-old in the background at any time, if you are a parent, you're thinking about how to talk to your children about many of the things that are happening. And some of that can be very close to home. You could be suffering loss, you could be suffering grief, you could be hurt by discrimination experiences. And so we have a very important talk today in this season with one of the leading experts in the country that we're very excited to bring to you today. Before we get to that, I want to introduce my co-host, who is a wonderful expert in her own right. And this is Dr. Aisha White. Dr. White is the program director for the Positive Racial Identity in Early Education program here at the University of Pittsburgh, or PRIDE for short. It's out of the Office of Child Development and School of Education. She's an experienced instructor, program developer, a coordinator in areas of media, early literacy, and public broadcasting. He is also the executive director of Rights and Responsibilities, a human rights organization that uses film and other media to focus the eyes of the world on human rights issues impacting people of African descent. Dr. White earned her Ph.D. in Library and Information Science, her master's degree in Library Science, and her bachelor's degree in Media Communications, all from the University of Pittsburgh. And if you don't know her work with the PRIDE program, you should. They do wonderful, wonderful work supporting Black families and parents of Black children on promoting pride in early childhood. So Dr. White, how are you? Welcome. Great to see you again.
Great to see you too, James, and you too, Rihanna, and welcome to all of our guests. I would like to introduce Rihanna to everyone. Rihanna Elyse Anderson, Ph.D., LCP, is an assistant professor in the Health Behavior and Health Education Department in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. Her scholarship addresses culturally specific parenting practices to reduce race-related stress in families. She earned her doctorate in clinical and community psychology at the University of Virginia and was a clinical and community psychology pre-doctoral fellow at Yale University School of Medicine. She was a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health leader at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Anderson strives to improve psychological outcomes for Black youth through culturally and contextually relevant parenting programs focused on racism and discrimination, effective coping strategies and community building, partnership, and collaboration. One of her primary goals is to create interventions and youth centers which support the mental and physical health of Black youth in urban communities. Dr. Anderson aims to facilitate healing in Black families with practical applications of her research and clinical services, as well as through teaching, mentorship, and policy recommendations. Prior to her doctoral training, Dr. Anderson graduated from the University of Michigan with degrees in psychology and political science and taught for 2 years with Teach for America in Atlanta. She also conducted community-based participatory research at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore and neuropsychological research at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Anderson was born in, raised for, and returned to Detroit. There's something about Detroit. She enjoys all things food, sports, and travel, and is adventurous except for the outdoors. She enjoys listening to and playing music and adores cooking for friends and family, not to mention herself. You can also catch her at Carnival and eating cake pops. So welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you so much. And we also just learned Brussels sprouts is another very important thing. So cake pops and Brussels sprouts for me. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to see you today. I'm really excited to talk about healing racial trauma, racial socialization as a clinical strategy for Black youth. If you are on the Twitter, feel free to follow along at Riana Elyse. I love when folks are tweeting during the talk and engaging in conversation in that way as well. So feel free to join along at Riana Elyse. So Jay opened us up nicely by talking about this time that we're in right now. We're in a pandemic, and what is that? Well, it's an outbreak of a pandemic disease or virus. So then a virus, we have to understand what that is, and that's a harmful or corrupting influence. It's an element capable of copying itself and having a detrimental effect, such as corrupting the system or destroying data. You might ask, well, what does it take to control a virus? So right now, the news is ablaze with this idea of inoculation or vaccination or intervention, systemic interruptions like addressing the source or treatment as in healing. But the question that Jay so readily prepared us for is, which virus are we talking about? We're in a system that has exposed us to 2 pandemics right now. In fact, Dr. Evelyn Hammonds of Harvard said there has never been any period in American history where the health of Black people was equal to that of white people. Disparity is built into the system. So we're not just talking about COVID, we're talking about a systemic pandemic that's impacted Black Americans from the beginning of our American history. Said another way, in the School of Public Health, we talk often about social determinants of health, and you see a few of them on the screen here. And often we see these interconnecting systems between things like the labor market or criminal justice system, healthcare system, et cetera. But what Reskin argued is that central to this idea of those interconnecting systems is racial discrimination at the core, or racism as a system at the core of these interconnecting systems. Without racism being central, there would be no way that any of these things could stand on their own. So racism allows the inequity that we see in things like COVID disparity with respect to transmission or mortality, the capacity of hospitals to take in families. Those are the things that are reliant on this system of racism, this pandemic of racism that we're facing. One way that I really like to describe this is by showing, as a mental health professional, showing the impact of racism on mental health and the impact of these dual pandemics on that mental health. So take a look at the screen here, where we're seeing the early mental health impact of COVID in, say, April to mid-May, where this chart is showing us that Latinx and Black folks are hovering at about 40% with respect to anxiety and depression. So in a given year, anxiety and depression is closer to about 13% or so. So we're seeing a 3-time increase with respect to anxiety and depression relative to that same point last year, right? So a 3-fold increase. And we're seeing disparities between races as well. So even though white, Asian, Black, and Latinx folks all had increased anxiety and depression, you can see here that Latinx and Black folks almost have a 0.3 increase over their counterparts. So generally speaking, we're seeing an increase over the same time last year, and we're seeing racial disparity within that increase. That's what we're seeing here. But what's shown when you fill in the entire chart is that after that, quote, second pandemic reared its head at the end of May, where George Floyd was killed, while Black folks were getting used to the idea of the pandemic, we were trying to figure out, how do we cope? How do we engage in the resources in our community? Are we going to be well? So you're seeing that this number is tapering off at the end of May. But when George Floyd was killed violently and virally in front of us, that number ticked back up to 41%. So 4 out of 10 Black Americans were experiencing anxiety and depression after the witnessing of the second pandemic. So there's no doubt here that those dual pandemics have impacted our mental health simultaneously. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, we'll be talking about racial discrimination quite a bit today. And the way that I define that is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people on the grounds of race. Something that we talk quite a bit about in our work is that at least 90% of Black adults and youth as young as 8 experience at least one incident of racial discrimination per year. But our colleagues have produced literature this year that indicates about a daily average that hadn't in the past considered social media as an example. So now we're looking at 5 incidents a day or more for Black children relative to what we thought of just that one incident per year, that major racially discriminatory event per year. Now we're seeing many incidents even per day for Black youth. Now, we know that discrimination types and experiences can differ. We know that they can happen to an individual. They can happen through perhaps social media where you're seeing other people being impacted. They can be systemic laws. They can be practices of an institution. They can be something that I know is happening that's objectively racial, or it can be subjective. I think it's racial, or someone tells me that it's racial. But the way that all of these different variations of discrimination come together expose that great percentage that we just talked about, or that great incidence rate. Quite a few instances that are happening as a result of the variety of discrimination types. Now, in children, discrimination is associated with more than just these psychological outcomes. So we're talking again about mental health today, but it's not a complete picture until you understand the whole evidence of what racial discrimination is related to. So as a mental health researcher, we know that you can think about what are all of the things that make up mental health variability, or you can say, what's the thing that's most predictive of mental health? So when we think about what's most predictive of mental health problems in Black youth, racial discrimination comes up time and time again. And it's not just mental health, it's all these things that you're seeing in front of you. But we are going to focus on stress and trauma today and how racial discrimination impacts that. Racial stress and trauma, if you're not familiar with it, is the dangerous or frightening race-based events, stressors or discrimination that overwhelm one's coping capacity, and impacts the quality of life and or causes fear, helplessness, and horror. And these can be symptoms of, as a consequence of emotional pain during and or after discrimination. So well after something has happened, this might come back up for folks. In that way, it's similar criteria to PTSD and can actually lead to a PTSD diagnosis, but it's distinct. So some of the work that my colleagues and I engage in look at how these distinctions appear. So it can be due to an individual experience, which is how we consider PTSD right now, but this ongoing collective experience, this historical narrative, this cellular history that's been within our bodies, our minds, and the fabric of this very nation is something that can lead to racial stress and trauma, unlike normal, quote, PTSD diagnosis. And again, it can be linked to these adult and youth outcomes in academic or cognitive spaces when people are ruminating and not able to focus on what's going on in the classroom, for example. Psychological, my depression or my anxiety might be heightened, and physiologically, so my blood pressure, my gut, these things that are starting to bubble and boil because of these experiences in the world. Briefly, some of these experiences like re-experiencing arousal, negative emotion, or avoidance, these are some of the more stressful or traumatic instances that we can point to that are racially specific. So as an example, for negative emotion, Black middle school students have higher rates of depression in the context of discrimination. So again, just pointing to how are these stressors and these traumatic experiences impacting not just the mental health, but all of these different facets of the life of this child. It is extensive, it's chronic, and it is pervasive. And now I can blabber for a very long time, but I always think it's really important to get a sense of what racial stress and trauma is from the mouths of the babes themselves. So I'm gonna play this clip of AJ, and I know our time is limited today. So what I'm gonna ask you to do is while you're watching this clip, while you're watching and listening, to be mindful of three things: what it is that you see, what it is that you hear, and what it is that you feel. So we're gonna get into our clinical bag today. See, hear, and feel. And when you see something, hear something, or feel something, go ahead and drop it in the chat. We're not gonna be able to take a lot of time to unpack this today, but when you see, hear, or feel something, drop it in the chat with what you experience with AJ here.
So what are the problems that we're facing today?
Oh, racism. Cops killing Black people. Just like mostly about like racist. Like cops is killing Black people, and the cops that kill Black people is white. You ever notice that?
So what do you think that means? Like expand on that for me. Talk to me about that.
So what I mean about that, like the Black people don't like, the white people don't like the Black people. So like the cops is like trying to get rid of the Black people faster so they can live longer, but they just trying to get rid of them.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know.
How does it feel when you see things like that?
It hurts.
All right, so folks are starting to drop things in the chat. What it is that they see, a lot of fidgeting has come up. What they hear is that AJ at his age is able to talk about the systemic nature of racism, that he's identifying and talking about the systemic nature of it. And then people feel heartbroken. That's come up a number of times, actually, interestingly, from multiple people: heartbroken, sadness, et cetera. So please feel free to keep dropping those comments into the chat. I'm just going to talk for a bit about what we know about AJ and why we utilize AJ at this time. So AJ, one of the reasons I don't share his age is because when I'm able to really interact with you and talk about what it is that you see, hear, and feel, people will talk about this idea that he doesn't quite know what he's saying, that he's struggling to say some of the content here. And I like to remind people that AJ, in this developmentally normative setting, in a classroom setting, eating a water ice, which in Philly is like a slushie, but we won't go there. I know that the folks in Pittsburgh know all about this, so we're not going to get into it today. But he's eating this cherry water ice, He's doing this developmentally normative stuff like fidgeting, right? So if we know that there's a young person, especially a young boy in a classroom, that might be an expectation that we have. And he's 10. He's 10. And he's talking about systemic racism at 10. And he's trying to put pieces together at 10. He's telling you this aha moment about how there's a systemic problem between white people and Black people at 10. And what breaks my heart the most, and really what resonates with me the most, is the moment that he turns to the facilitator and says, "Did you ever notice that?" That moment breaks my heart, because surely you couldn't have noticed that. Surely people haven't seen this before. It has to be a new phenomenon, or else something would have been done about it. That's what I hear from AJ when he's talking. Did you ever notice that? Because I'm 10 and I'm noticing that at 10, and this is impacting me at 10. And at the end, he says it hurts. So we know that he's being impacted by something that has not actually happened to him, which goes beyond our PTSD diagnosis. It's racial stress and trauma.
So what are
He talks about being challenged in talking about what's going on around him as well. He mentions it being challenging to talk to his family because he doesn't quite know what to do with this hurt. And he goes on to say that outside of the video. And that's because racial discrimination compromises our normal coping processes. So the literature says that African Americans use more avoidant coping only when faced with racially discriminatory events. So let me break that down. It's two findings in that. One, if Black and white people typically use the same amount and type of strategies, approach-oriented or avoidant-oriented. So approach, maybe I'm gonna talk to the person who has confronted me or write a letter or something of that sort. If I'm engaging in approach-oriented versus avoidant, I'm not gonna go to that store. I'm not gonna tell anybody about it. I'm gonna hold it inside. Black and white folks tend to engage in the same types and amounts of coping strategies with respect to general stressors. But there are racial differences when you add this factor of discrimination in. And so they start to use different strategies, which means there's between group differences, but also within group differences. So Black people only resort to that type of strategy more when discrimination is at play. That means that there is a reduction in the availability of coping options. So if I want to do something about this racial discrimination in the world, if AJ wants to do something about it, he's now thinking about fewer options to engage in it versus the availability of all the options for general stressors. What parents try to do, as Jay mentioned in the introduction, is to attempt to socialize their children around this idea of coping, what to do about racism, with racial events in particular. So it takes a separate skill set and effort to do something about these racial discriminatory events because racial discrimination is so unique. Said another way, for folks like AJ, humans have life-threatening stressors that activate a physiological stress response, like seeing a tiger in the bushes. But the problem is that people who experience discrimination are endlessly seeing tigers. So you can imagine if AJ is looking around and seeing police officers and having this generalization of what happens with those police officers, it's like him seeing a tiger every time. He's going to be aroused. His stress response is going to trigger every time he is engaging with people that he feels threatens him. What we do is consider this racial socialization, these conversations that parents have about these tigers or the racial discrimination in the world around them is called socialization. And it's communication between family about the racial world as a means to better cope with that discriminatory event. Now, I could blab on for days about what this is, but my colleague and I are going to demonstrate what racial socialization is through this very corny video that we have a series of mental health videos about. So I'm going to let them take it away. This session is dedicated to the youth who have been killed by discriminatory practices, including
Laquan McDonald,
Tamir Rice,
Ayana Stanley Jones,
Michael Brown,
Trayvon Martin.
Oh, man.
Lee, what's got you worked up today?
Man, it's another one of these headlines talking about a young kid killed by a police officer or a dang on vigilante.
Man, I don't know what it would have been like to have race all in our face like that growing up.
You mean like the O.J. Simpson trial or the L.A. riots or Rodney
making.
Snap, man. I didn't even think about the fact that young kids can pick up on race like that.
Yeah, I mean, by 3, kids are starting to see differences in the race. By 7, they're making meaning of those differences. And by 10, they're starting to think about their own role in that difference.
If only there were a way for parents and children to talk about race effectively.
But there is. So racial socialization is all about the way that parents teach kids about the racial world around them.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure I follow. What do you mean by the whole socialization thing?
Yeah, well, you know how we tell kids to look both ways before they cross the street or not to talk to strangers, right? So racial socialization is about race specifically. I bet you can even think about a few things that your families told you about what to do when you were growing up. Think about cultural socialization or pride.
You mean like celebrating Kwanzaa or going to the African American Museum or singing songs like, "Say it loud, woo, I'm black and I'm proud."
Yep, that's it. How about preparation for bias?
You know what? Every time I get in the car, I can hear my mom's advice telling me where to put my hands if I ever get pulled over. 10 and 2.
And yet we've seen plenty of evidence that shows even when we follow these rules in every situation, it doesn't work every time.
Yeah, so what about like when people get upset when things do actually happen?
Well, that's also type of a socialization, right? So we call that promotion of distrust. It's when stuff happens and we want to pass that distrust down to our kids.
I've heard some people go in the opposite direction. I mean, talking about the fact that race doesn't even matter at all anymore.
Yeah, well, that's our last category, right? So some people call it post-racial, some people call it egalitarianism, but it's all about being equal despite race.
Great. I mean, that's a ton of strategies. I mean, so which one should we choose?
Yeah, well, the good thing is you don't have to choose just one. Most parents do a blended approach, but it's about the type of blend that makes sense. So preparation for bias and pride messages together typically yield better psychological, academic, and identity outcomes for youth.
So what should we be telling youth who need to know about the world around them?
Well, the good thing is we should be talking to youth, right? So kids are totally observant. They're seeing these headlines. They're not missing it. So we need to be talking to our kids first and foremost. And we need to be providing them, again, with those blended messages, pride and preparation, messages and activities, so that we can let our kids know that being Black is a beautiful thing, even when other people don't think so. I'm Ree.
And I'm CT.
And this is our Mental Health Minute.
You are young, give me anything.
All right, so Jay reminded me that we are award winning, so thank you. We're corny, but award winning. All right, so with racial socialization, what we talk about quite often are those headlines, right? And this year, unfortunately, I can update and create a fresh new set of slides on this virtually every month. We're seeing George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. We've seen so many instances where Black folks have been killed for doing very normative things. The same things that we talked about with AJ, these normative things that they're doing, sleeping, walking, talking, whatever it is that they're engaging in has been enough for some people to feel frustrated by that. And children are not missing these headlines. They're seeing them and they're being impacted by it. The talk as a result has been something that a lot of people have been interested in learning more about. One thing that I think is incredibly just well said about the talk and about both the pressure that parents are feeling in giving it and what children are understanding is what David Allen said this summer in a Washington Post article, and so I'll read it here. I got an "I Can't Breathe" tattoo on my chest back in 2015, probably a year after these words were choked out of Eric Garner. My 3 biracial boys have seen it plenty of times, but we've never discussed what it means or why I have it. We were talking about George Floyd recently when my 10-year-old asked me about the tat. Those were George Floyd's last words, he said. But you've had that tattoo for a while. How did you know he was going to say that? I could see his mind working as I was formulating an age-appropriate answer. And before I could respond, he said, "Oh, I know. This has happened before." I want to be excited about the peaceful protests and nonviolent demands for change. I hope change is coming. Really, I do. But what I am is tired. I'm tired of still hearing it's heritage, not hate. I'm tired of still reading, well, how many of them shot one another in Chicago last weekend. And I'm tired of expecting that I'll be long gone before my kids, their kids, or anyone down the line are seen as equal to some of my friends' kids. So with much appreciation to David Allen for those words, that's exactly what is facing Black parents today. The way that we typically measure what David has done with his kids, or what a number of families have been doing, is through this idea of content. So the things that we talked about in the video, and frequency. So how frequently are we saying these types of things that we said in the video? But there's been a lot of mixed findings. So you can imagine that certain racial socialization strategies are associated with more positive outcomes, whereas saying some things like, oh, you can't trust any police officer, you can't trust any white person, might be engaged or might be associated more with anxiety and depression. And there's also this discrepancy in transmission of content and frequency between reporters. So if you're a parent, you know, or you've worked with kids like myself, how many times you have to remind kids to take their medicine or to do something, right? If we're thinking about inoculation, how many times would you have to engage in protecting them from something before they say, oh, I get it, right? So it's not gonna always be a one-time or a one-to-one association between I told my kids and they get it. I'm gonna skip over this because I know that we don't have much time together, and I wanna be sure to answer questions. But the way that our lab is starting to think about racial socialization, or the talk, is instead of looking at the quantity or the amount of times you've talked about it with your kid, we wanna know about the quality of these processes. So we're thinking about competency perspectives. That is engaging in the reduction of stress, or the improvement of skills, or the improvement of confidence. So even if we don't know if these outcomes are necessarily going to change based on what we've told our children, the psychological process of feeling like we are empowered, feeling like we know what we're talking about, engaging in all of the different types of coping processes that are available to us, is going to make us as parents feel mentally well, and it's going to help our kids to also process what it is that's going around them, to talk to us, to feel open and competent enough to come back, to ask questions, to engage in these conversations, and to think about what it is that they actually want to do about what's going on in the world. In a really complicated theory that I'm not going to go too deep into, we'll see that there are some traditional types of discrimination and stressful events that lead to the way that folks cope, that then lead to the outcome. So this is a really basic stress and coping line down here, where there's an event that leads to stress. That stress makes us question, how are we going to deal with it through our coping? The way that we cope is going to tell us more about some of those outcomes that we talked about. So really traditional stress and coping. What my colleague Howard Stevenson and I have done in this RECAST theory is to say, actually, if we think about how competency of the talk plays a role in this racially specific stress and coping model, we see that the more competent a parent is in giving that talk, the more efficacious their child is going to feel to do something about it. That efficacy to do something about it is actually going to lead to them doing something about it, and feeling like and knowing that you can do something about it is going to relieve your psychological distress from feeling encumbered or hampered by not feeling confident that you can't do something about it. So essentially what we're saying is, the more we focus on the talk as a mental health exercise, as something that's going to improve our ability to have this conversation with our children, the better off our children will be as a result of feeling efficacious, feeling like they can cope, actually engaging in coping behaviors and having beneficial outcomes. So that's what RECAST is all about. This theory, we argue, predicts how well African-American youth can critically and consciously reappraise and resolve racial conflict by facing and challenging the habitus of expendable Black humanity. So the more we think about how we can ensure that Black humanity is the forefront of some of these conversations, then that's what this theory is helping us to unpack. How can we support Black people in their striving for humanity? So at this point, we know the problem is racial discrimination. We've got a theory that I just talked about with RECAST. Well, why won't someone do something about it? That's me back when I was able to get my hair done. It was straight. I'm here to do something about it, and I'm excited to tell you what that is. So I'm gonna spend the last few minutes of the talk today talking about Embrace, which is engaging, managing, and bonding through race, which is a 5-session family-based intervention designed to do all the things that we just talked about. So increase family socialization competency, the ability to talk about race with each other, reduce that stress and trauma that comes along with not being able to do something about it. So again, by improving self-efficacy and coping, we help to reduce the stress and trauma that comes along with those experiences. And eventually we want to improve some of those outcomes that we talked about, like psychological, physiological, academic, et cetera. The skills that folks develop in Embrace are engaging in this challenging racial content, managing the stress that comes along with that through a process called CLCBE, which I'll explain in just a bit, and by bonding. So this is a very difficult thing to do, to talk about race with each other. So how do you improve your skill in just bonding with each other? We're the first racial socialization intervention for adolescents and parents, and we seek to provide support for the theory that we just talked about, the RECAST theory, and some of the practices that are culturally specific to interrupt racism as a virus. So in other words, we're moving the talk to the walk. Shout out to Migos, who are displaying it here with Drake. So this is the same model for RECAST, but I wanted to just highlight a few of the things that we do through Embrace to apply the strategies from that theory. So for the event and the stressor, we want to increase the awareness of what that stressor is. Can we even appraise it as racial, right? Do we even know that what is bothering us is a racialized event? How can we then improve our stress management as a result of being more aware of what that stressor is? For the racially specific content, we want to think about how do we reinforce those racial social strategies that are protective, the ones that are actually improving mental health and well-being, and how do we advance things like self-efficacy for our children so that they feel like they can do something about. Finally, for some of the outcomes, we're thinking about how do we encourage things like racial assertiveness to feel like you can engage in coping strategies that are more expansive. And how do those coping strategies then lead to some of those outcomes that we've been talking about all along: mental health, psychological, physiological, and academic. So briefly, let me tell you a bit about the pilot that we ran in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. We had Black 10 to 14-year-olds and their caregivers, and we encouraged them. We thanked them for their time with a $100 completion bonus and with various things from the community as well, some in-kind donations. We recruited from schools, we partnered with behavioral service agencies, and we also utilized social media, word of mouth, and community flyering. We've developed a clinical manual and a participant guide. So this content has activities for parent, child, and family. It's developmentally appropriate. And these are 30-minute parallel sessions. So the parent and child are engaging in their own sessions. Then there's a 15-minute dinner and a 45-minute conjoint session. So a 45-minute family-based session that brings everybody together. We engage in things like behavioral activation and role playing as well. Just a quick nod to some of the media that we use. So in a conversation about growing up Black, there is a line that we really like to focus on, if it wants to pop up. Uh-oh. All right, media finally took me out. The technology is not on my side today, but this is a video, and I encourage you to look up these conversations about growing up Black on New York Times. There are these documentaries that are videos of families talking about race. So in the video, a child says that he's being hunted. What has it been like as a parent to have a Black child at a time where they feel hunted? And to the child, we might ask something like, how does it feel that your parent would have to warn you about racism? So we take media, the same things that sometimes are scary for families to see, or that sometimes create the stress and trauma, we take it and actually use it as conversation starters. We also integrate various CBT strategies in clinical care. So the TFCBT's practice model, we take and actually integrate it with some of the components within Embrace. And so I'll pop over to the next slide so you can see an example of that. For the A, the affective identification, the purpose of affective identification is to help recognize and communicate feelings associated with experiences of racism and discrimination. And once folks are able to identify and communicate their feelings, they can begin to tolerate those distressing emotions and change the thoughts associated with them. So we might ask families, what recent experiences have you had with racial discrimination, and how did they make you feel? So we're targeting those things specifically, and we're asking about the emotions tied to that stressor. There are a number of other cognitive behavioral strategies, but for time purposes, I'll let you just go ahead and take a quick look at that, and I'll also provide the slides so that you have some of those elements as well. I'm going to also skip over CLCBE a bit faster than I normally would, but it's one of the strategies that we use in taking that affective identification. So once you've thought about how it is that you felt, we actually give you some more criteria to talk through that feeling. So not just stress, not just frustrated, but you're able to give some anchoring to it on a scale of 1 to 10, for example. How stressful was it? So then you talk to us about just how stressful it was. Locate in your body where you feel the stress. So now you're saying, okay, it was very stressful and I felt it in my stomach or in my head. You're able to give more words to it. And then the last step in this is communicating the self-talk going on in your head. For a lot of people experiencing discrimination, we internalize, we think about what's going on with us. What did we do wrong? And so we often say, what if I had just worn ... What if I had just said, what if I had moved out the way? You're thinking about what you did wrong, but this allows you to get it out of your own head, to get outside of yourself, to think about, well, why am I feeling that way? Why would it be something that I did wrong? After you are calculating, locating, and communicating with a therapist, we then encourage you to breathe in and exhale out slowly so that you're engaging in relaxation after such an effective exercise. If we had more time, I would unpack this with you, but this would just be an example of, again, exploring the dysfunctional schema that folks are experiencing based on what it is that I just mentioned in the prior slide. All right, so I'm going to tell you just a bit about our pilot results, and I'm really excited to engage in questions and answers with you, so I'll kind of go a bit faster through this. But essentially what we're seeing here, when you first come into Embrace, you say that I can cope pretty well with what's going on in the world with respect to racism. When you're in our program a bit longer, you see, okay, maybe I'm not as high in my coping skills as I once thought. And in fact, that relaxation is what drops off the most in the second session. So literally saying I can't breathe, right, which is a part of our breathing and exhaling exercise. Literally, that's what this is saying here. It's harder to breathe when you're talking about racism by the time we get into our second session. But by the third session and by the end, families are improving in their coping strategies. And in fact, by the time they leave out, they're habituating. They're saying that stress no longer impacts me as much anymore, and I can cope more effectively with the racism that we're talking about in the session. Qualitatively, families are engaging in a way that it felt good because like we can talk about like what we've seen. So like we won't have anger built up inside of us. So again, taking what's inside and putting it back out in the world. Managing, a youth indicated getting to get stuff off my chest about how I feel about white people and racial experiences was really helpful. And that parent said in teaching him like, you know, this is going to happen, but this is how you react was really helpful in getting that anger out of their chest. Finally, with bonding, a parent indicated prior to Embrace, I thought I was well informed about how my child thought about certain situations. Since Embrace, I now listen more and encourage more communication from my child. So even though this is really challenging stuff, these families were able to bond better as a result of working through this together with Embrace. I love showcasing our families, and so I just want you to hear a bit about what Ben has to say about his experience.
Embrace helped me open up about some racial situations that actually happened to me, and it served as a support group for what I was thinking. It helped me think through what I was thinking. And it also served as a catalyst for conversations strictly about race instead of having race as the subtext of a conversation.
Pure genius. And then this is Ben's mother.
Embrace helped me get to know him better and also be more open to listening instead of being in mommy mode all the time. You do this, you do that. I was challenged developing the words to have conversations about safety with law enforcement and confronting bias in the classroom. And it also helped in conversations we have here at home about our history, ancestral history, personal histories, and when talking about his future.
So there's a case study if you want to learn more information about that family. Anderson et al. 2018 can give you more about them. So just to let you know where we are now, we've been able to publish a number of things about the work, the theory, the intervention development, the case study that I just mentioned, and some of the preliminary outcomes. And we've also been funded to do this work by a number of organizations. So for all the trainees online, I just want to indicate that racial content can get funded, and you just have to know your funders. You have to get a sense of what the funding situation looks like in the world, but don't be discouraged. You can get funded to do this work. I think the chapter of every book on 2020 is going to be But Then COVID. And so our next stop was going to be Detroit. We got sidelined for a bit because of COVID, but now we're working overtime to put it online, and hopefully I'm going to launch next month with our families here. So we have community partners who we work with, the Children's Center of Detroit, the Black Family Development Incorporated organization, and we'll be working with them to launch our work again in January. I'm going to skip over these next few just to make sure that we have time for questions, but just want to show there are not only individual impacts for our clients, but there are things that we as clinicians have to be aware of as well. So if you check out a paper from Salim et al. 2020 that I'm on, we're looking at providers living in this cultural world, and we are socializing agents as well. So we have to be competent. We have to be mindful of some of the work that we're engaging in with our clients. So we have to know some of the same things that we talked about already to this point to make sure that we are competent in engaging with families through things like Embrace or our regular sessions. So again, encourage you to check out Salim et al. 2020 for that. Our goal is to directly work with families, which we've done, to better train clinicians and research staff with the content that I just talked about. And our goal is to reduce and one day eliminate discrimination as a driving force of health. So what we know, just to conclude, is that viruses reduce in harm over time. Inoculation allows us to heal while devising the new strategy. So vaccines can help us to stay safe while we're thinking about how do we eradicate this harm. But we still constantly prepare for safety, even when we know that that vaccine is coming. Like right now, I hope all of you are wearing masks and engaging in safe practices, even though we know that the vaccine is coming. So even though we know that we can't prevent racism right now, we have to prepare the best way that we can for it. Racial socialization allows for this preparation and healing. And the major key is that it keeps children emotionally safe while we're building this vaccine. It's not that we're taking the blame off of the sickening system. We know that the system is the problem, but we're focusing first on the life of our children and the quality of that life. How do we ensure that they are alive and well? And how does racial socialization create essentially a stopgap while we learn how to eradicate racism? It takes a dual approach, both of engaging in that safety and making sure that they're safe through that vaccination. To keep kids safe, to keep our Black kids safe, let's get our masks ready for them. So thank you so much for your time today. Feel free to get in touch, and I would love to answer some questions that have been popping up.
Welcome, Dr. Anderson. How are you today?
Oh, it has to be 2021 when you are on two Zooms and you're trying to navigate so that y'all aren't hearing the one that I'm on. It's a mess. This is 2021. This is just how it is. So I'm good, Jamal. How are you today?
Well, thank you. Thank you. We had some questions and they were put in the Q&A, and
Sure.
We also have some questions about people wanting how the best way to get in contact with you. But we'll get that. We'll get to that.
Cool. Well, thank you again for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I do want to just take a moment to say that I appreciate your willingness to watch video. I know for the participants here, you have been watching Zooms and videos for a year plus. I have been exhausted. And so I just appreciate folks' willingness to say, like, this is a good ability to do a hybrid. So I'm really appreciative of that. I'm here totally flexible with respect to your questions and really excited to dig in.
Thank you for that. We appreciate you having made the presentation when you did, because it was, I feel, very relevant to a lot of what we have going on in society today. So with that, we will start to ask some of these questions that are coming in the Q&A. So Kayla Hudgens ask. She says, because violence has really been at the forefront of so much of the discrimination and racism we have been exposed to because of social media, do you find that young children like AJ look to respond violently or cope more violently out of retaliation and anger because of the violence they are seeing against people of color like themselves?
Such a great question. I'll say that I don't have the data on that, but what I can say is that we learn by observation. Like there have been Bobo doll experiments from the 1950s of what behavioral observation does when you watch someone punch this doll to the ground, and then you put kids into that room next, they are more likely to punch that doll to the ground, right? So I'm saying from a perspective of what we know about science writ large, if you are displaying types of behaviors, you're essentially teaching people this is how you act, which is from a tangent side. When we have kids and we say, don't hit other people, and you're spanking them or you're telling them don't hit while you're hitting, that is counterintuitive because we're teaching them that hitting is a consequence for something. And if they feel that someone has wronged them, they may try to hit in response to that. So we're teaching that this is a behavior that's fair. So I am saying, based on science, that would not be a far-fetched conclusion. And I want to also add that it is something that should be a natural response to feeling rage. So I think one thing that we often see, particularly with Black communities, is we're going to have an onslaught of violence towards you. We're going to harm you. And we want you to respond with peace. That doesn't make sense from a psychological perspective. That does not make sense from an observational perspective. That doesn't make sense. None of that really makes sense. And if you do respond in peace, you're still likely to go to jail or be harmed or have some of the same consequences as if that anger or that rage comes out. So I'll conclude here by saying that the folks who I work with don't see rage or anger as a bad thing. It's a natural response to both the feelings that one has about what's happening to them and the observation of that same violent behavior toward you. So I hope that helped in that response.
Thank you. Do you believe that critical race theory would help to address some of the disparities in achieving equality? Ooh. I believe that people are not aware of America's history of maltreatment of Black people.
All right, let's get into it. So this is so funny because I've been kind of chomping at the bit to say something about it. Critical race theory is plastered all over the news. And I actually just thought of something earlier today that would help for anyone on this call who may think that critical race theory is being taught in schools right now. I'm gonna pivot a bit from the question and then come right back. Critical race theory, for folks who may not be super aware, if we want to distill it to its most basic form, is understanding how race impacted the past, how that past is influencing our present, and what we can do to change it for the future. At its most basic, that's what it is. It's using a critical lens to do that, and it was developed in the field of law. So if you want to just say, like, what are the basics? It is a critical theory that allows people to understand how race existed in laws from the past, currently, and what we can do in the future, right? So that's CRT. If you think a fifth grade teacher is teaching a fifth grade student that, you are mistaken. And I'm going to give you some evidence. So in 2 studies, one was when I was in LA trying to get the Embrace program in a school after I had met with them multiple times. And in a study this year in which we were simply asking about student experiences of racism. We weren't even trying to intervene. There was no behavior whatsoever. Both of these schools denied both that study, but both the programmatic piece and just the study, just the question, because of the word racism. They thought it was too inflammatory. So if you have a theory called critical race theory that you're trying to bring into schools, you can only imagine how that would get batted down very quickly. So I just want to acknowledge, for anyone who's nervous about CRT being taught in schools, it's not happening. They don't even like to use the word race. They don't like the word racism at all. But the question is, would that be helpful in reducing racism and teaching about it? in understanding the history of racism in America, right? We don't even have to go to a collegiate or a law school theory to go there. We can talk simply about what 1619, the 1619 Project did, which was open up just simply a different perspective of not 1776, but 1619, and how that was so challenging for some people to hear. They couldn't understand that their history was not what they had been taught. So we don't even have to go to, do we need to critique race at a theoretical level in the law? We don't have to go there. We can just say, what is it about American history in books that are flawed, in teachers who aren't getting the right training, right? In all of these spaces where this truth isn't coming out, is there a way to simply add a different perspective to have some discourse around that? Can that open up the minds of students and teachers as well? So yes, I absolutely think CRT is something that we can start to integrate, but maybe not even at that full level because it's not developmentally appropriate for kids in K through 12 as an example, but simply bringing in a different perspective. Have you read this curriculum around 1619? Have you read some of the articles that were put out? Have you seen this YouTube video that differs from what we see in this book? And how can you go about comparing, contrasting, thinking through what that might mean if there was actually something different than the truth you have been taught? So I'm not quite sure if I got at what you were asking, but certainly we need to have a discourse or a critique of what is presented to us, because we know that oftentimes those books, or again, the education that those teachers have been provided, is not the whole story.
And I think for me, just thinking about back from, high school experience and things of that nature, if you would just teach Black history as American history, I think that would maybe even start to alleviate some of that, but another conversation. Someone wanted you to elaborate on the 1619.
Okay. I would encourage you to check out the 1619 Project if you want to give that a Google. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is a New York Times editor, was able to put together a series of works that explored 1619 as a founding, quote unquote, of America relative to the 1776 narrative that had been put forth by other scholars. So I would just encourage, I can certainly go into it, but would really encourage you to just check out the 1619 Project. Give it a Google. It's one of the most explosive pieces of reading that I've read in quite some time. It's quite fantastic. And yes, she won award after award. She's in the news quite a bit right now. So I would just encourage you to give that whole situation, Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 Project, give all that a Google, and you're going to have some fun today learning about that.
Thank you. So next question is, can a white therapist effectively do the Embrace program with Black families, or apply the principles of the Embrace program in therapy with Black families?
In fact, it is what we need you to do. So let me kind of rewind a bit and tell you how naive I was. When I developed the Embrace program in Philly, my goal was to work with hella Black therapists. We were going to work with hella Black families, and it was going to be the best thing on earth. And then I looked around and realized that 3% of all therapists are Black, and we have 12 to 15% of folks in the US, let alone concentrated urban areas, where that population is going to be multiple times what is in the population of therapists. So just sheer number wise, that's not going to work. But the second thing is that who am I to say that you should not be competent to work with my kiddos, my community members, my people? That is not only problematic for me to think that, but it's a problem within all of our therapeutic approaches if we can only work with certain populations. Right. So I want to talk just quickly. I know in the talk I mentioned it, but I want to take a quick dive into this idea of racial socialization competency. I know that sounds like a mouthful, so let me try to break that down. When we talk about racial socialization, or the talk, right, all those clips that I was showing you that people have talked about with their kiddos, everything that's coming up in headlines, that's the talk, what we do to engage in conversation about race with children. Whether you're a parent, a provider, like a therapist, a teacher, we socialize children around the idea of race all the time with what we say, with what we do, with what we don't say, and what we don't do. As therapists, we have to be competent. That means we have to have the skills, the confidence, and reduce stress when we go into those conversations. And every child is deserving of you being competent. It's not fair for just one group of people to be competent in that conversation. Again, because our children are often seeing white therapists or teachers and things of that sort. And so it's incumbent upon us to do a few things to get to the point where we can be competent. The first is to do our own research. So as we've been talking about already, if you haven't taken a deep dive into Googling CRT or critical race theory, if we haven't done a deep dive into looking into the 1619 Project, if you haven't thought about for yourself, how do I think about race? How has this past year with the racial uprising impacted me, my family, et cetera? If you haven't done that unpacking, it's time for you to do that first, because we're bringing in all that luggage and baggage into the room. And they know it. Our kiddos know it. They can read us quickly, right? So you want to know for yourself how you're feeling. You want to practice it with other people. So maybe not just with other people, grabbing materials, utilizing books, utilizing YouTube videos, which I saw someone just say, which is fantastic. Taking other things to say, these people have already talked about it. Let me utilize that. And then let me practice that with other people so that I have the experience. That's going to increase your confidence, reduce your stress, and improve your skills. So all of those methods of unpacking first and then trying with other people and utilizing materials is going to help you be more competent, and simply acknowledging, I don't know what that experience is. And as a Black therapist, I don't always know what that experience is. So it's not fair for me to go in like, oh girl, I know exactly what you're talking about. I don't. That's not my life experience. As I wouldn't with another woman, as I wouldn't with another young person, as I wouldn't with anyone else of matching identity, I wouldn't assume that I know what they're going through. They are the experts. So saying, listen, I'm loving that you're talking about that here. How can I be more supportive? Asking those types of questions. And again, being willing to say, I don't know what that experience is like. Can you help me so that I can help you? Is our job as therapists across identities. But for race, we've been taught to just stay away, from it with a 10-foot pole. And that's what makes us incompetent. So again, to conclude, absolutely 5,000%, everyone should be competent in talking not just about race with Black children, but a number of identities with folks. It's just that we've been taught to handle race differently than we've been taught for other identities.
Thank you. This question came up in the chat, and we asked Brandon to put it into the Q&A because I thought it was really interesting question. He wanted to ask about your views on how the media is handling racial socialization. He said he asked because he noticed that Station 19 and Grey's Anatomy, which are TV shows, focused heavily on George Floyd's death and the cultural impact that it had pretty heavily. It felt wrong to him because it seemed as though those television shows were using an innocent man's death to push ratings. How do you feel about it?
That's interesting. So it's amazing to me whenever I meet people who still ask me what the talk is. It's amazing to me that folks aren't hearing about it. So I'm thrilled that it can be brought into our lexicon, into our conversation, any way that we can get it there. So I understand that ratings is a real thing. I also understand that there are a number of people who don't know that talking about race is an important practice that happens in a lot of homes and not in a lot of others. I'm going to quickly use just a bit of data to support that. So I work with the Sesame Street folks, and we did a study that looked at what are the things that parents think are most important to talk to kids about. White families, by and large, said just being a good person, right? That just being a good person is an important thing to talk to our kids about. I have no doubt that that is true. We want to talk to our kids about what being good is. But when we ask that same question of Black families, when we ask that same question of Latina families, race shoots right up to number one. It's one of the most important things to talk about, even with kids as young as 5. Race starts to move up developmentally as children age, but race is going to be an important thing to talk about even with young children. That means we're living two different experiences. That means what happened to George Floyd resulted in a number of conversations for Black families that white families did not have. And that's true of all of the murders that have happened prior to George Floyd. But that George Floyd did turn that conversation into more of a national talk is something that was important and is the reason that I'm doing all of these talks around the country today. You know, the reason I'm on all these advisory boards is to say, oh, you all know about it now. There's a whole group of us who've been studying this for decades. Let's bring that into your show in the appropriate way, in the way that we know it actually happens, right? Let's have a talk on Sesame Street with the new Black characters between father and son. Like, this is actually happening on Sesame Street now, and it had not happened in its 50-year history, right? So if it does, I don't want to say take, because certainly George Floyd's life mattered more than just his symbolism, right? And there was no reason for his life to be taken. I don't want to say that. If we are considering his life purposeful in this movement, though, then that it is one of the elements that came about, that became a more national way of thinking about the talk across media, across the TV and news and things of that sort.
Thank you. So I know you had mentioned about potentially, and when you were in California, putting embrace into school. So Aaron wanted to know, how do you adapt this model for a school system? Is it just for parents and children, or could it be adapted teacher to student relationships to increase understanding and well-being in the classroom?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's one that I get asked about a lot, and it's one that I grapple with a lot. Teachers and frankly, clinicians are not trained really to talk in ways that we need to with kids. And there are some times that I don't want to work with teachers. I'm just going to keep it honest, with teachers or schools, because that's such a large place of racial trauma for our kiddos. And so we launched Embrace in a school, and we heard a student say, oh, that's where my teacher said X, Y, and Z to me right there. It's not that can't happen in a clinical space. Clearly that could happen, or in any other space, but we know how much racial trauma comes out of school. So I believe in my spirit that there has to be a series of things that teachers have to do differently before they get to a level to utilize Embrace or something of that sort. And thankfully, there are a number of people doing that. So you all are in Pennsylvania. I did a fellowship at Penn, and my mentor there, Howard Stevenson, the great Howard Stevenson, is working diligently in Philly to do work with schools and with teachers. And so he and a whole number of fellows are working there. Some of my mentees at Stanford are doing this work in schools. Some folks actually at Pitt are doing this work, Jay Hughley, and that was the talk that you saw me give just today. So there are a number of people across Pennsylvania and the United States who are doing the work in schools. It's not my position to work with them at this moment, because I do think that it's going to take a lot of unpacking for teachers in particular. I do think therapists are more ripe for this, because we have training programs that do allow us to tap into our own beliefs before we talk to clients. So I do think that there's a bit more opportunity to do that. Whereas teachers, it's often very external. There's a lot of how are you impacting other people, but there's not a lot of time to unpack what's going on for themselves. So I think we would need to build that in before we would have an Embrace for schools, for example. But just to piggyback on that, we are working on how do we put this online. So the next 5 years, I'm going to be working on how do we take this so that it's outside of the clinical context and families can click a button. But I do also have colleagues who are working on this as well. So in the next 5 years, I would say there should be a good number of materials for people, whether you're a clinician, a parent, or a teacher, that's going to be available. And I'm excited for that to roll out.
Thank you for that. Carly says that in the past, she's been accused of being a white savior, of having a white savior complex. She says she really hopes that's not true, because she sees herself as a staunch ally and advocate. She tries her best to just listen and then do what she can to do to help. Her question is, what can she do as a white person to be a better ally and advocate for Black youth and their families?
Yeah. Generally speaking, listening is the thing that I recommend all the time. If you have a client who's coming in, and maybe listening and observing, right? But you have a client who's coming in after George Floyd is murdered, or you're a teacher, and the first thing that you want to do is talk about, classroom circle time, or you want to say like, okay, based on what we talked about last time in session, what's going on? If you don't acknowledge and bring that into the space to let them know that then you're missing an opportunity there. If you want to go with the status quo, then you're missing a really great opportunity to just show them. And maybe they don't talk about it that day. Maybe they don't say, oh, I've been waiting for you to bring it up. Let me just go ahead and tell you everything that's been on my chest for the past 5 years about this. Maybe it doesn't work out like that. But you're starting to build this sense of trust with them that is around, okay, they acknowledge it, all right? Maybe it would be safe to bring a few things in. And again, if I'm bringing something in as that child, and then you immediately just jump on, oh, I know I've been doing the readings. And if you kind of cut them off and don't give them that space, they're going to retreat again, because that's not going to be a safe space for them to unpack. So I would say more than anything, listening, and not in a voyeuristic way, not like you trying to extract from them, but you're doing your job. You're really letting them unpack, and you have to untrain yourself for that discomfort that we've been taught to feel around race and racism. We have to untrain ourselves to say, I am a clinician first. I want to know what this child is experiencing. And for me to do that, I need to give them the space and also let them know that I'm aware enough that they can bring that in. But the second you try to dominate that conversation or show them that I think that's going to start to deteriorate that a bit. So I would encourage you to keep doing what you're doing, and maybe make some amendments if you are taking up space in that room, to realize that it's not about you at that moment, to kind of step back and prioritize the wellness of that Black child.
Thank you for that. Carla asks, have you had an occasion to speak with white parents of their Black biracial children about this topic? What were the takeaways there?
Yeah, so this year was a tough year. We were supposed to kick off Embrace in Detroit on March 13th of 2020. And you are shaking your head, Jamal. Why are you shaking your head? It must have meant that it went really well, right?
And then March 16th happened and everything shut down.
I mean, it shut down, baby. So yeah, in Detroit, we got that rug pulled under us quickly with respect to research. And I felt conflicted. And I'm going through this whole thing because I just want you to understand before we get to the family what this year was like for us. Felt conflicted on doing research during COVID online. Like I really took time before we launched Embrace in a via device, right? Via computer. I don't want to call it online yet, because I think that there are online things we would have to do to actually flip it, and we're not quite there yet, but just offering it in a virtual space, right? It took us a long time to actually do that, but then we did do it. And so now you've got COVID as a backdrop, you've got racial uprisings as a backdrop when we launched it this January. And so we had a white mother, we've had a number of family arrangements, but this year we had a white mother with her biracial child who felt like there was some conflict in the house, and there was. And the parent was very resistant to hearing from us about what they could do, which is ironic because they were part of the program, and they stuck with it. They stuck through all 5 sessions. So again, as a therapist, there's something in me that lets me know that she knows that something ain't quite right. And that's why she's sticking with it. But she was resistant to hearing that. So to put that into perspective, what I would take away from that, and this is a N of one, right? This is one person. We can't base our entire study on this one person. But we've had a 5-session model that traditionally worked well with Black families. A lot of them still want more resources or more opportunities to chat. So it is still a bit brief, though on the other hand, you don't want it to be too long, because then you may lose other families. So we're trying to find a sweet spot, but there may need to be some you have a child of a different background than you, materials that we give to folks before they come in, because it didn't seem that she was as receptive to what we wanted to do or talk about. And that may have meant that she didn't get the most out of our experience. Again, we've had like Latina parents, we've had grandparents, we've had a number of different constellations of families. And so it's not, I'm not going to take it just with this one family that we're going to have to change our whole program. But we may need to think about, if there's not a common language or a common experience of having been socialized in that way, that there may be some buffer materials at the beginning that we provide so that we can jump into a place that's a little more consistent with our program. So that's what we took away with that one family, but we're looking forward to many more conversations with folks of different backgrounds soon.
Thank you. Francis would like you to speak about the concept of expendable Black humanity.
I saw that as soon as I jumped on it, I was excited to talk about that. So Francis, this is not my term. I didn't coin it. But really the idea that even if we start from this idea that Black people were 3/5 of a person, even if you want to just go there, that there is not a full humanness to Black people is one of the foundational concepts that this country instilled into us from a very long time ago. Which means if they are disposed of, if they are, and it doesn't have to even be something as extreme as death, though I do think we see that more often in our media or in our conversations than not. But we're talking about kicking them off of their property or land. We're talking about giving them substandard schools, any of the social determinants of health, what stores are around them nutritionally, how much green space, what the transportation system looks like. If you look at these interconnected systems, all like 10 or so of them, healthcare, education, we can just keep going with what these systems are. It makes sense that if Black people aren't viewed as fully human, that they are not going to have all of the rights and privileges as other people in those spaces. They're expendable, that their humanity is not seen as essential or as full as other people. And so them not having that fullness makes sense to people. They can be, there's a throwaway nature of that, oh, well, it's okay that those children didn't get the quality foods that they need, because there's this belief that Black people aren't as fully human as other people. So when we say expendable Black humanity, it's this idea that like, all right, if they are killed, then there must be some excuse, right? Like because they're not seen in the same way as other people, they have to have triggered something. There must be some rationale. And I'm going to take a bit of privilege here to just pause and say that you see this in media often when we're talking about Black children, why they were shot, a Tamir Rice, a Mike Brown, a Trayvon, the stretch of what the media will try to say about those children versus what I read this morning. There is a white woman who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. That is a federal law that she broke. She's one of the first people who is being indicted for this and is having some time in parole. So she's not being sent to jail. There was a full 3 or 4 paragraph explanation in the article of what she did, who she was and what she did. She was a mother of several children, a grandmother of several children, works in the community, volunteers. They would, and the tone of the article was actually pretty hostile towards her at the beginning, right? It was saying that the point of this article was to say that the judge was repudiating the Republican vantage point of wanting, these people to be treated in a nice way. And so this judge is throwing the book at these people, right? Giving them the longest parole sentencing or incarceration sentencing possible. So it's a pretty hostile article, but the bottom 3 or 4 paragraphs that went on to detail just how wonderful this person was and why, she didn't deserve jail, but just parole, reminded me once again that there was a 12-year-old boy, Tamir Rice, who was villainized for playing with a toy gun. He should not have been playing with the gun in his neighborhood park. He wouldn't have been killed if he wasn't playing with this toy gun. He got in trouble at school once for something. So you're seeing these paragraphs written about children at the beginning. Mike Brown, comma, someone who stole a packet. I mean, it's immediate what happens to our beautiful Black children in these media pieces. And so I'm saying that because this is an example of expendable Black humanity. When you rationalize, there's a reason why the Tamirs, the Mikes, the Trayvons, and a number of other children or people writ large of color who can be killed, who can be deprived of their rights, et cetera. That is what expendable Black humanity amounts to. It is in everything that we do and think about Black people.
Agreed. What can you tell a child that is afraid of police or enforcement to help them feel safe and confident?
We just had this conversation with Sesame Street. All right. There are two things that have to happen, because in order for those kids to feel safe and confident, the police have to do things that don't make them feel unsafe, right? So we can't just tell kids, be safe. This is something, and I'll try to shorten this answer because I know we only have a few minutes left. Whenever I do the talk that I just gave to y'all or other types of talks where I show AJ, people are like blown away. And those people are typically white women who are like, why would AJ be afraid of the police? They have no conception for why Black children would be afraid of the police. Their job is to protect and serve, right? So why wouldn't AJ want to be around them? So communities have very different ways of seeing the police because of the police experience within those communities, right? We are taught to observe, to learn things by observation, and that informs how we act, right? How we are fearful then of that type of presence in that community. So I can't tell children to be confident, to be assured of police presence if what they're seeing does not make them safe or assured. So I just want to start there. I don't want to lie to kids either and say like, they're totally, totally great. There's no reason to fear them. But what I do know as a clinician and as someone who looks at this data, it is a fear that is disproportionate to what is actually happening. So we are seeing a lot of sensationalized cases for Black death, for the treatment of police officers to people in communities. I'm not saying, again, that is not happening. It is absolutely happening. But what happens when we are fearful of every single instance of that, or every single person representing a group, is that we're going to be the ones who are anxious or depressed. And that's going to impact us more than it does the people that we're fearful of, right? So I would say that while it is true that there are disproportionate cases where police officers are violent toward people of color, it is also true that we can't be walking in fear all the time, because that's going to make us sad. That's going to make our mental health not so great. So and to be honest, I don't know what that balance is. I don't know what to say after that, but I certainly say to families who are working with Embrace that these things are both true, that there are some challenges with the police. And if we internalize that on, then we're going to be sick. And so and then I put it to the families, what do you think would be the way that we can handle that? So that's something that I think you, your families, your clients can work out, but I absolutely present both truths to people.
Thank you for that. I know that we only have a few minutes left. So we're going to end with this question here. How do you respond to folks who say that by talking about race so much, we are just creating further divisions in society and causing kids of color to think they can't be successful in life?
Oh, my favorite question. Also, just putting in a lot of my contact information. So if folks do need to drop off, you can email or get at me there. So let me just finish that. Okay, those are other ways to find me. So here's my favorite question on earth. Is talking about race and racism the thing that's keeping it going and making our kids sick from it? Here's what I say. In 2019, if we looked at worldwide plane crashes, let's call it 350. 350 people died on plane crashes in 2019. Over 360 Black people were killed in the United States by police officers just in this country. So I'm going to say that again. In the entire world in 2019, 350 people were killed on planes in plane crashes, and over 360 Black people were killed in one country, in the United States of America, by police violence. What on earth am I talking about? If you get on a plane, every single time you sit on that plane, someone is telling you what to do in the event that that thing crashes, correct? So you are told what to do with this oxygen mask, with your seatbelt, et cetera, with turbulence. So you are anticipating, all right, if this plane were to crash, these are the maneuvers that I would go through. Are you really going to be able to survive this, inferno plane crashing, or are you going to remember any of that? That's not the point. The point is that they do it. It's a public health measure to keep you safe and well. You are informed of the risk, and then you are told what to do in case that risk happens. It is more rare that that risk happens globally to you than in the United States, dealing with one system, the police, one system. I'm not even talking about the rest. And these are fatalities, right? Yet we don't talk to our kids, or we're fearful that talking to our kids is going to somehow make it such that they are prepared for this thing that happens. And it's not if this thing happens. 90% of kids before the age of 8 talk about experiencing discrimination. And now, again, those rates are 5+ instances per day because of computers. Children are facing racism and discrimination every single day. We don't have to be the ones to tell them about it because they already see it. But if we wait to tell them about it, they are already starting to psychologically process what to do without you. And that's like going up in a plane that's now experiencing turbulence or is about to crash, and you're looking around like, what do I do? The mask has fallen. You don't know what to do with it. So I use that analogy often because we have public health measures to keep us safe in a number of spaces: cars, planes, vaccines, et cetera. And I can use analogies for all of those, right? And yet somehow we think for this one thing, this one phenomena, this one social phenomena, that if we don't broach it, our kids are going to be okay. That's counterintuitive. It's not true based on empirical studies out the wazoo, and it's not true based on a number of things that we do to keep people safe in other domains. So again, the data really suggests that preparing our kids is the best way to keep them well, to keep them healthy, and to let them process, oh, this is what this is what that turbulence feels like. This is what they were telling me about. Now I know, I'm going to buckle that safety belt. I'm going to put that mask on. Now I know what to do because this is what we've practiced.
Thank you for that. I see that we have hit 4 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of our time. Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for this presentation and the wonderful Q&A that we just had. I think everything that you spoke about has given people a lot to sort of think about and go back and do some research and look at some stuff. So thank you for that. Reminder for all of you who are seeking continuing education credits, please use the link in the email you received today. That will take you to a PDF with instructions for credits from UPMC. When the webinar ends, you will be prompted after the meeting and through an email tomorrow to participate in a brief survey about the presentation and download your certificate of attendance. This is separate from continuing education credits. Our next presentation will be Who is in a Room? Supporting LGBTQ+ Community Conversations on Sexuality and Gender by Yolanda Turner, Ph.D. on Thursday, June 29th, 2021 from 2:30 to 4 p.m. We look forward to seeing you then. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Jamal. Thank you, everyone. Take wonderful care.
Do the same.